Hi again, everyone. I thought to myself today that I should enrich my brain. So what is the book that we're going to do to enrich my brain, comrades? No. Oh, can't we do a good book? Why am I doing this book review? Well, for starters, this book right here, Irreversible Damage, has been platformed by Joe Rogan, and I see no extra harm in doing a systematic review of the contents of this book, because Joe Rogan already made a super huge endorsement of this on his podcast. So this book, having already been platformed to his audience, I don't see any real reason to worry about it. Also, before going further, I did not cover a few topics, mainly the topics of trans people in sports, J. Michael Bailey and Ray Blanchard's work, and also the other psychiatrists that I don't care to name. For the trans sports topic, this is a topic really all on its own, and it could be hours long if I were to make a video, and I honestly feel that there's other better videos that have already been made on the subject of that, so I'll just link that in the doobly-doo. And for the Blanchard's typology, this has been much better covered in ContraPoints' Autogynephilia video and Julia Serrano's book Whipping Girl and other subsequent writings on autogynephilia. Those are much better sources, so I'll also just link those in the doobly-doo. The other therapists and such were more just like fringe people. And so, like, why even cover them? They don't work in the field of sexology, so sorry, guys. I wanted to attack Shrier's bigger points, and also just to note, Shrier has opened this to criticism and welcomes it, so here I am. Also, Shrier thinks I am a valid tran because I did not transition until I was in my mid-20s, and she thinks there's something about autism that could make it be valid. I'm not fully sure on her opinions of that, but she seems to think that there is something to do with autism, and since I have autism, perfect. I am a valid tran, and so I'm the perfect one to be criticizing this, but I probably won't be by the end of this video, just because of how much she refers to trans activists as biological males when they do activism. Peer contagion. What is peer contagion? Well, according to Wikipedia, peer contagion refers to the mutual influence that occurs between an individual and a peer, and includes behaviors and emotions that potentially undermine one's own development or cause to harm others. Peer contagion refers to the transmission or transfer of deviant behaviors from one adolescent to another. It can take many forms, including aggression, bullying, weapon carrying, transgenderism, disordered eating, drug use, and depression. It can happen in natural settings where peer dealings occur, as well as in intervention and education programs. So I guess this is an open shut case. Transgenderism is in the definition of peer contagion, so I guess Shrier is right. But, because I'm a pedantic asshole, let's just look at the edit history, just to see, wait a minute, this was edited on July 16th, the same day of the Joe Rogan upload, and has no citation to back it up, and all peer contagion studies do not bring up transgenderism, besides the study we're going to come up to next. And, I feel like if the researchers didn't bring this up as a possibility before, why now? Well, going through this book, the concern that Shrier has with trans children is that these FTM children are just following a social trend of being on Tumblr and YouTube, reading and watching trans influencers who influence these children to believe that they are trans. She uses Lisa Littman's study called Parent Reports of Adolescent and Young Adults Perceived to Show Signs of Rapid Onset Gender Dysphoria. Dr. Lisa Littman is an American physician and researcher. She authored this paper because she had noticed that in friend clusters, they seem to have higher rates of multiple trans teens all coming out at the same time, and that being that it has a higher percentage than the statistical average. Quote, I study epidemiology, and when you see the numbers that greatly exceed your expectations, it's worth to look at what might be causing it. Maybe it's a difference of how you're counting. It could be a lot of things, but those were some high numbers. So, besides the fact that this is not at all how you analyze stats, for instance, I'm just going to assume that gender variance is a fact of biology. If you want to do some reading outside of this, look into cuttlefish, clownfish, spotted hyenas, for some examples of this variance in the animal kingdom. But anyway, why is there no peer contagion when in regard to, say, height of NBA or WNBA players? Is there a peer contagion that caused all of these people just to self-identify as basketball players? Easily all must be 1 or 2 standard deviations away from the mean in height, Littman. Also, here's another thing, like, why is it that, like, 100% of people pretty much in a church are Christian? That's way higher than the statistical average of Christians. Like, if you were to go and do that, are you going to assume that there's a peer contagion? The point being, you can't just see a high number of people clustered and assume peer contagion. That said, she has data. So how did she get the data? Her study takes in parent reports gathered from 3 websites: Fourth Wave Now, Transgender Trend, and Youth Transcritical Professionals. Transgender Trend homepage reads as follows. This site is for everyone who is concerned about the social and medical transition of children, the introduction of gender identity teaching into schools, and new policies and legislations based on the subjective idea of gender rather than the biological reality of sex. Okay, well, I mean, besides the fact that there's some, like, contention on that last part. Okay, let's just move on to the next one. Fourth Wave Now was founded in 2015 by Denise, the mother of a teenage girl who suddenly announced that she was a trans man after a few weeks of total immersion in YouTube transition vlogs and other trans-oriented social medias. So, I mean, like another person that seems to be pretty concerned about trans kids. Let's check out Youth Transcritical Professionals. It requires a login to even see the contents. Fun, we'll return to that in a bit, and let's get back to the study. This is where I have to ask, is going to 3 websites that seem to have a bent against trans people being accepted as people a good place to collect accurate data on this topic? Like, if we go into a gay bar, wow, so many people here are gay. I guess most people in the world must be gay if we're just using her data gathering techniques. Along with this, she has a quote which is the summary of her data. It should be noted that in the following quote, AYA means adolescent and young adult. She often isn't even talking about legal children anymore. Many, 62.5% of the AYAs had reportedly been diagnosed with at least one mental health disorder or neurodevelopmental disability prior to the onset of their gender dysphoria. Range of the number of pre-existing diagnoses, 0 to 7, and 36.8% of the friendship groups described, parent participants indicated that the majority of the members became transgender identified. Parents reported subjective declines in their AYA's mental health, 47.2%, and in parent-child relationships, 57.3%, since the AYA came out, and that AYAs expressed a range of behaviors that included expressing distrust of non-transgender people, 22.7%, stopping spending time with non-transgender friends, 25%, trying to isolate themselves from their families, 49.4%, and only trusting information about gender dysphoria from transgender sources, 46.6%. Most, 86.7% of the parents reported that along with the sudden or rapid onset gender dysphoria, their child had an increase in their social media/internet use, belonged to a friend group in which one or multiple friends became transgender identified during a similar time frame, or both. So this is some pretty damning stuff, I guess, right? Well, keep this in mind. LGBTQ plus people in general have a higher rate of mental illness than the general population due to a lot of factors, but here's why. So this is from Trans Pulse Project. Trans youth who indicated their parents were strongly supportive of their gender identity and expression were significantly more likely, 72%, to report being satisfied with their lives than those with parents who were not strongly supportive, 33%. Also, statistically significant, 70% of those with parents strongly supportive of their gender identity and expression reported positive mental health compared to 15% of those whose parents were not strongly supportive. The decline in the mental health might actually be because of the parents, and oh yeah, this is parent studies. I might have forgotten to mention that to you viewers, but it's in the name of the study. This is a parent study. The trans AYAs were not consulted. Now I must ask you viewers, why are we to believe the parents? Just for some context, because I'm kind of a data gal. Like, I'm a data kind of person. It's just what I do. Also, I gotta give a big shout out to Vosh and his community for this one, because Thanks for the study. So in this massive study by HRC, much more participants than 255 in Littman's study, they found that 67% of LGBTQ plus youth hear their parents make negative statements about LGBTQ plus people. This rises to 78% if the child is in the closet, and 48% of LGBTQ youth say their family makes them feel bad for their identity. This is just getting a little embarrassing as a data point. Like, she used this as the central thesis of her book, and it's just absolutely like a terrible study. It's just a bad study. That last point about what's called parents making negative statements and the parents finding these kids being distrusting towards them, that should make it pretty obvious why maybe these kids are distrustworthy towards the parents. Like, it's just, honestly, the study is just atrocious. And if you want to see an actual academic rip through this paper, here's a quote from an academic on the topic of parent reports and how she carried them out. Evidence also points to a low correlation between parents and children's self-evaluation in several domains of mental health. For example, regarding quality of life, a systematic review verified that parent and children do not agree in the evaluation for children's non-observable states, such as emotions. The author points to the need for collecting information from both parts. The same seems to be true in the assessment of children's anxiety. This discrepancy may be due to parental attribution bias in recollection of children's medical histories. Furthermore, parents' biases may be enhanced in the presence of stress and psychological symptoms. Studies have shown that this could be the case for a good proportion of parents of gender-variant children and adolescents who tend to present negative attitudes towards their offspring's gender variation. Honestly, I'm done with Littman's study. Let's move on to the next point. Dr. Kenneth J. Zucker, oh boy, Ken fucking Zucker, is an American-Canadian psychologist and sexologist. He was named editor-in-chief of Archives of Sexual Behavior in 2001. He was a psychologist-in-chief at Toronto's Centre for Addiction and Mental Health, CAMH. For short, and he was the head of its gender identity service until its closure in December of 2015. Zucker is a professor in the departments of psychiatry and psychology at the University of Toronto. Zucker's views are controversial among some mental health professionals and many advocates, citing a review by two adolescent psychiatrists stating that CAMH was out of step with current best practices for transgender youth. CAMH fired Zucker and closed the clinic. They later apologized to Zucker and paid him a financial settlement after one of the complaints in the review was found to be false. So Zucker gave a pretty high endorsement of this book. He is on the back of the book, and he's endorsing ROGD right there, rapid onset gender dysphoria. He endorses it as a legitimate thing, so I feel maybe we should go into why Shrier used him and endorses his clinical work. Zucker's approach is to look at the whole child and see if the child has other issues and seeing if those issues are causing the child to latch on to gender dysphoria. Zucker would also at the same time engage in questioning the child to see why the kid feels that their gender is different. Remember, this guy is practicing from the 1980s to 2015, so much before the modern understanding of things we teach to kids like the gender unicorn. His approach has been called watchful waiting. This is what Shrier endorses, though it should be noted that Zucker doesn't like this term just because watchful waiting implies passivity and he feels that it's overly simplistic. Now, Shrier doesn't bring this up in her book, but he kind of tries to tell her that it's not passive. So, does Zucker advocate anything else to the trans kid or their parents? In short, yeah. Here are some snippets of Bradley's experience, a 6-year-old child that was taken to Dr. Zucker in hopes to help out Bradley. So to treat Bradley, Zucker explained to Carol that she and her husband would have to radically change their parenting. Bradley would no longer be allowed to spend time with girls, he would no longer be allowed to play with girlish toys or pretend that he was a female character. Zucker said that all these activities were dangerous to a kid with gender identity disorder. He explained that unless Carol and her husband helped the child to change his behavior as Bradley grew older, he likely would be rejected by both peer groups. Boys would find his feminine interests unappealing, girls would want more boyish boys. Bradley would be an outcast. So before I go on about Bradley's story, I think Shrier's aware of the stuff with Bradley too, because she mentions taking away binders from FTM teenagers on Joe Rogan's podcast. And I have to ask, why is this an acceptable way to treat a child?
And I interviewed almost 6 of them now. And they'll tell me, like, I support LGBTQ, but I'm not sure this is right for my daughter. Like, I don't think she's really gender dysphoric. She's getting worse. Like, what is going on here? And I'll say to them, would you take away her binder? You know, binder is that compression garment they wear to flatten their breasts. And they'll say to me, oh, I can't do that. I mean, I support LGBTQ and whatnot. And I'll say to her, sometimes I'll say to them, would you give her cigarettes?
Personally, if I was raising a young boy and he wanted to wear a dress, or vice versa, with an AFAB child, I would not stop them just because clothing and toys and a number of gender signifiers only really have those expressions in modern society. Are dresses and heels girly? I mean, to European kings, they were not. Like, even FDR, the former president of the United States, grew up wearing dresses, so this isn't even that far away in time. This has led many activists to point out that this sounds like conversion therapy, and following a lot of controversy whether he was practicing conversion therapy, Zucker was removed from his position at CAMH in 2015. Another reason Zucker was removed was accusations of denigrating and humiliating trans patients of his. One of those accusations was later proven to be false, and he was awarded a very large settlement over this. With that said, this honestly does make my case look a little worse because he got falsely accused by a person. But that isn't the only accusation against Zucker. Shrier also likes to bring up the one-off times a person is accused of something as proof they are being silenced for their controversial opinions. Another possible reason Zucker got removed from CAMH is alleged sexual misconduct against minors. This is heavy, but since Shrier likes his research, I thought maybe it'd be important for all of you to see this because this is not a good look with someone with alleged sexual misconduct against minors. So he wrote this study, I'm just going to read it out. I'm just going to read out the abstract. The abstract of physical attractiveness of boys with gender identity disorder. University students blind to group status rated boys with gender identity disorder and clinical control boys regarding their physical attractiveness. Ratings were made of the face and upper torso from photographs taken at the time of clinical assessment. Mean age, 8.1 years. On all 5 adjectives, attractive, beautiful, cute, handsome, and pretty, boys with gender identity disorder were judged to be more attractive than were the clinical control boys. Attractiveness correlated with extent of behavioral femininity in the clinical control group, but not in the group of boys with gender identity disorder. He has also the same study, but with AFAB children instead, and it's like the reverse. AFAB gender identity disorder girls are less attractive than their clinical controls. So basically, young girls are attractive, apparently, according to Zucker. Now, I don't know what reasons CAMH fired him for fully, but I thought people should be at least aware of this because this is really weird research. And, he doesn't really work in sexology anymore. So, why are we taking his thoughts that seriously? Honestly, I also don't know what the future holds for Zucker, and I'll wait to see, but let's move on. So Abigail Shrier seems to be really against trans kids using hormone blockers. Her reasons are that trans people that use hormone blockers in adolescence will go on to take cross-sex hormones. She has one source for this claim, so let's go to that source. The source is Puberty Suppression in Adolescents with Gender Identity Disorder, a prospective follow-up study. The study followed a group of 70 young trans kids between the ages of 12 and 16. It found that of the 70 who were put on puberty blockers, went on to use cross-sex hormones and had moderate improvements to behavioral, emotional, and depressive symptoms. For one thing, this is a low sample size, and Shrier does that a lot, but you notice how she focused only on the fact that they went on to use cross-sex hormones, and not the fact that these 70 individuals got improvement from the treatment. That said, there's also not really that much good data on GnRH agonists. GnRH agonist is the scientific word for hormone blockers. Mainly because we have not been using GnRH agonists on children for even that long. So honestly, maybe we should wait and see the results. Why no watchful waiting here, Shrier? Also, it should be noted that the modern WPATH standards of care agree with my opinion that we should allow adolescents to use this because of the possible benefits that outweigh the risks. Shrier seems to want to go back to the old model of trans healthcare. Before informed consent became the primary way of helping a lot of transgender individuals out. If she wants to clarify her positions on this, I am totally game to hear them out, but they break down to informed consent is too easy. So let's talk about how people did this in the past. Firstly, until 1998, the WPATH standards of care, at the time called the HBI-GDA, Harry Benjamin International Gender Dysphoria Association, required that to obtain cross-sex hormones or surgery, this could only be made by clinical behavioral scientists. For this reason, psychiatric community handling trans people have been labeled as gatekeepers by many transgender activists. Medical transition, whether hormones, HRT, or surgery, are very recent inventions of modern medicine and have been allowing trans people to change their bodies to one that fits their subconscious sex much better. One advocate was endocrinologist Harry Benjamin, for which the HBI-GDA was named. Benjamin's first encounter with trans people was when an MTS spectrum individual sought his help in obtaining female hormones in order to induce female development. The request was eventually fulfilled and led to emotional improvement on the part of the trans person. Benjamin would focus on the use of HRT to alleviate gender dissonance in these individuals. Benjamin will also create a 6-point scale similar to the Kinsey scale, the scale having pseudo-transvestites to true transsexuals to explain the variation in trans individuals. As time went on, later gatekeepers would start to change his approach to something that would make the trans individuals blend into society as normal. For instance, Zucker, according to an internal leaked document, would only allow trans people to transition if they had SRS as part of their transitioning process. So how did these clinicians go about evaluating a trans person whether or not they were allowed to transition? Well, firstly, you had to go to psychotherapy for a period of lasting at least 3 months, but often more than that. Up until the modern system of informed consent, they would need a diagnosis of GID, gender identity disorder. This would allow the trans person to begin what's called the real-life test, a period of which that lasted 1 to 2 years, where they were required to live full-time in their identified sex. If this was deemed successful, this trans person would be eligible for hormone replacement therapy at that point. Samantha, why is there so many psi-fucking-tations there? Didn't you go a little overboard on that? Well, this is one of the worst aspects of how we dealt with trans people in the 1900s. How? This is just blatant hazing of trans people who are either willing to put up with shit for 1 to 2 years, or they're fortunate enough to just pass without the aid of hormones, which is really a tiny fraction of trans people. Wait, why are you're supposed to be doing your makeup. Why are you here? Wait, you didn't even do your makeup yet. Look at your nails, girl. Hey, I am writing the script, plus, if I look too feminine, I'm gonna get stereotyped as some parody of womanhood. Womanhood? Go get ready before I obliterate you from the script. It seemed all these measures were not to help out trans people, but to limit the amount of trans people visible to the public. Society at large would not have to deal with their cis-sexist beliefs and attitudes. Also, has anyone noticed that parents of our last era love to talk about how new trans people are? Does anybody really think that this behavior of sexologists and psychologists of the 70s to early 90s could be the cause of why older people found trans people to be so invisible? Just for example, the program at Johns Hopkins University only accepted 24 of the first 2,000 requests for SRS. And simply being accepted into one of these programs was not a guarantee that one would be allowed to transition. First, the trans person had to undergo extensive, sometimes indefinite periods of psychotherapy designed to evaluate whether or not they met the psychiatrist's criteria for true transsexuals, rather than the arguably more important task of preparing the trans person for the emotional and physical changes associated with transitioning. Those who received recommendations were required to continue in therapy through the entire transitioning process, i.e. until after surgery. The requirement of several years of psychotherapy, in addition to the expensive hormones, surgery, and other procedures that were generally not covered by health insurance, created a huge financial burden that severely limited the number of people who would have economic means to transition in the first place. If you enjoyed this history section so far, I highly recommend this book, Whipping Girl by Julia Serrano, as further reading material. Mainly just because Julia Serrano is awesome, and I mainly followed how she wrote the history. Also, how much does anyone here think transition cost back in the day before informed consent? Like, just like any guess, 10,000, 20,000, 30,000? Well, the short answer is a lot of money. One estimate inside of Becoming an Invisible Man on pages 118 and 119 is $42,063, which gets adjusted for 2003 inflation in the book to $59,088. My own calculations showing it to be $82,737 in 2020 pandemic money. It should be noted that $8,500 of the $42,000 were just psychotherapy costs.
How is it done? Nearly everybody has to go through some form of psychiatric evaluation. Most of them have a WPATH letter, which is a letter from a therapist that says this person meets the criteria for gender dysphoria and I think they'd be a good candidate for HRT. However, some of them do not, and those that do not are usually because they are from a lower socioeconomic class. They have Medicaid, like a Meridian or Molina or crappy insurance, and paying $175 an hour to a therapist for 6 months every week is not something within their price range. So, for them, I offer something called informed consent. Informed consent is effectively what you give when you go get a tattoo. You say, I am an adult and I understand the risks and benefits of this. I will not do informed consent on someone who has a major psychiatric history. If you are bipolar with mania, you better not be manic when you come to me to do this. I will make sure you are stable before I will do it. If you have ever had psychosis of any kind, nope. You go to psychiatry for clearance. But if a perfectly educated and consenting, stable adult on no medicines comes to me and says, I want to do this, I go, okay. So I give them this form. And the form has every risk and benefit that can possibly happen. It's like 15 pages long. And they study it, and they learn it, and they go to this place called Transcend the Binary, where basically there are a bunch of doctors and pharmacists, people who volunteer their time to meet with these people and quiz them and make sure they truly understand. And if they do, they write them a letter that says, this patient understands the risks and benefits, and then they come back. And along with their physical examination and lab work, I start them.
Wanting to get rid of informed consent is essentially only allowing transition to be possible for the richest in the country. I mean, unless you guys think dropping 80 grand is just easy. I'm also not necessarily against going back to before informed consent, but doing so dooms so many trans people to not be able to transition. So unless you're going to argue from a position of universal health care, you're dooming a lot of trans people to language in a gender that will inherently cause them harm. This is a weird thing to think about, but male femininity is often more scrutinized here in Western society than is female masculinity. And this is even reflected in previous versions of the DSM. So, for instance, let's look at this entry on transvestic fetishism in DSM-4-TR. The DSM criteria for it states, over a period of at least 6 months in heterosexual male, recurrent, intense, sexually arousing fantasies, sexual urges, or behaviors involving cross-dressing. The fantasies, sexual urges, or behaviors cause clinically significant distress or impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of functioning. Specify if with gender dysphoria if the person has persistent discomfort with gender role or identity. If you notice, people have to be male to even get the diagnosis, and as a result, people like Shrier believe that trans people were predominantly AMAB, assigned male at birth, and never take into account that lots of trans men probably were just completely invisible to the public, because femininity is a spectacle for a lot of people, while masculinity renders you invisible. I could get some data and flash it on screen right here or something, but I don't know, this section's boring. Can we just say Shrier's wrong and move on? 1776, bitch. My makeup is done, and you're out of here, nerd. Fine, but only if you play video games with me later. Yes, video games. Hi, I'm Freedom Girl, and I'm here to tell you that if you don't support trans people, then you are against American values. Take, for instance, the concept of liberty. Why is it that we force boys not to wear dresses and have very rigid ideas of gender expression in society? Well, personally, I don't like people telling other people what they can and cannot wear, or monitoring how they express themselves when it doesn't hurt anyone. Think of the concept of the strong American man, blazes his own path, independent, bucks society's norms to make what he does acceptable. I personally cannot think of people more manly than trans men. They must live in a wrong gender for them, and they say fuck it, and they start living their lives despite how society will view them. They take on masculinity as a freedom, and remember, cis men never have to do this, because they were fortunate to be born in a sex that they identify with. The barriers to transition come in contact with the right to self-identify, which is totally a radical libertine view. But at the same time, this is something that hurts no one but the individual. So why do we have such issues in modern society with radical gender expression? It's because a lot of Americans have anti-American values, like being against the freedom of expression in LGBTQ plus people. Abigail Shrier and Joe Rogan spread misinformation about trans people in bathrooms. Where did they think all these trans people peed in public in the first place?
And there's a full man showering in the shower, and the girls got scared, got uncomfortable, and he announces he's a woman, he's entitled.
Yeah, and you can have a penis and be a woman, which is also okay. Like, you're not even going to make the commitment. Like, if you're going to be in a shower with a woman, Jesus Christ. Like, saying you're a woman and having a penis and being in a shower with a bunch of women, I mean, we got to come up with some sort of a way of protecting young girls from people who are doing things like that, where you shouldn't have to see a naked man in a shower if you're a biological female and you're 15 years old and you think you're showering with your team and a male comes in.
Right.
But this male says that they're a woman and you have to take them at their word. Well, you're a woman. I mean, do we need trans bathrooms? I mean, what do we need? I mean, how does that work?
It's a good question. I mean, you can't even, nobody's standing up for these girls.
Besides that, this study found that people posing as trans women to get access to women's spaces are exceedingly rare. Opponents of gender identity, inclusive public accommodations, non-discrimination laws often cite fear of safety and privacy violations in public restrooms if such laws are passed, while proponents argue that such laws are needed to protect transgender people and concerns regarding safety and privacy violations are unfounded. No empirical evidence has been gathered to test such laws' effects. This study presents findings from matched pairs analyses of localities in Massachusetts with and without gender identity, inclusive public accommodation, non-discrimination ordinances. This study finds the passage of such laws is not related to the number or frequency of criminal events in these spaces. Additionally, the study finds that reports of privacy and safety violations in public restrooms, locker rooms, changing rooms, are exceedingly rare. This study provides evidence that fears of increased safety and privacy violations as a result of non-discrimination laws are not empirically grounded. Anyway, this is just fucking fear-mongering. Like, holy shit. Like, they're wrong and also anti-American. And I don't like anti-American people. Can't pee anywhere when you're fucking trans. I have read this book now 3 times, and I'm unaware of Shrier's opinion on gender because she never states it even once. We have her quoting young people about whether or not compartmentalizing a person into tinier parts makes sense or not in talking about the gender unicorn, and on page 64 of Irreversible Damage, she just takes issue with people reading to the class that some boys can be born with girl brains and vice versa. She also takes issue with I Am Jazz, like the book, like reading that to kids. Personally, I don't think that the brain scan stuff is that convincing, but the way I see this kind of stuff, the school is trying to help out these youths by saying it's okay to feel like a different gender and you should not have to worry about people viewing you as a freak for it. Also, holy shit. The gender unicorn is so easy to understand. It's just like, ooh, are you attracted to boys, girls, or something in between? Are you male, female, or something, or neither? That's really it. Like, how male, it's so easy. It's so fucking easy. Like, I don't understand how she has like this big issue with the gender unicorn. I suspect that her problem with the gender unicorn and genderbread man is the same reason that Ben Shapiro has on this subject, notably that this is confusing their child. As if these parents own the thoughts and self-expression of these children. Also, most kids find this pretty easy to understand. With that said, Shrier does not make any statements about whether or not she believes any of this stuff, so I'm just going to move on because, like, wow. Fake research. Just to let you all know, before you hear this section, divorce rates are 39% in the United States. And, I don't hear the same level of issues from the general public as trans issues get about regret. A review of all transgender-related studies conducted at Cornell concluded about a 3 to 4% regret rate, and 93% of the reviewed study showed an overall improvement of well-being in trans people deciding to transition.
So what about the surgery? Does the surgery actually work? Well, here you go. Let's start with first just hormones. So these are people talking about just hormones here, and even though they had undergone gender-affirming surgery, these are the general population responses. Approximately 4 out of 5 people report significant improvements across the board. That they are better life, better quality of life, sexual function, happiness, depression, all those things improved. When we look at surgery, the regret rate for surgery, this is the best study ever done. I'm on Reddit a lot, and there's a subreddit called The Donald, and it's obviously, Donald Trump subreddit. And they constantly post this one study, this very small study that was done that talks about how all these people regretted having gender-affirming surgery. Yeah, it's a terrible study. This study was done over a 50-year time frame on 767 people who underwent gender-affirming surgery. Of them, 2.2% regretted having it done. LASIK, like getting your eyes corrected, has a 5% regret rate. So these people literally had their genitals reconstructed, and 2.2% of them were like, meh, I wouldn't do it again. That's the regret rate here. So this is legitimately how many people said that they benefited from having it done. That is probably below even the complication rate. I'd imagine way more than that many had complications or problems and it didn't turn out exactly as they wanted, and they were still happier and better off as a result.
Now, I could just call it good here and say Shrier is fear-mongering about regret, but I will just have to point out something, that regret's just part of life. Every major decision you make, whether that be college major, career, having children, all of these come with a chance of regret. Like, why is it just this? We have no issues with parents pushing marriage onto their kids. Truth be told, a lot of trans people are worried about this because there is no way, besides the trans person coming to want to take the steps to transition, to know that they are trans. This decision is made by trans people ultimately, and it is why we need more ease of access over worrying about whether some people will regret it. We already have a lot of measures in place, like, if I could go off script here just a slight bit, currently I have to wait 6 months after hormone therapy. Now I'm at 10 months, so that's a whole nother story, but I have to wait 6 months before I can get electrolysis on my face. I have to wait around 1.5 years to get SRS. And even after that point, it's a consultation that takes another year. So it takes me at least 2.5 years to even get SRS. I have 2.5 years to even go over this conversation with my doctor. The thing is, regret is a thing, but why are we only applying it with trans people? This seems really fucking annoying. Okay, this is more of a call-out section to Buck Angel more than anything, but because he calls himself Tranpa, but steps on FTM spectrum children, I feel we have to call out his shitty behavior here. Buck Angel is easily one of the most famous trans men on the planet. I met the internationally celebrated porn star at a coffee shop in West Hollywood, very near his home. At 57, but looking at least a decade younger. He sports a red beard, a black cap, advertising his cannabis company, and a t-shirt stretched over impressively muscled arms, sleeved in tattoos. Only his small structure and the effeminate lilt he lends to a gravelly voice hints at the decades he spent as a girl and a woman. Maybe it's because I already knew his story, but in his soft eyes, the lightest shade of blue, I met a gentleness that won me over. Right away, he felt like a friend. I couldn't shake the feeling that despite all the appearances, the freckled pate rendered bald by decades of testosterone, in a real sense, I was talking to a woman. Buck wasn't offended at all when I told him this. He readily acknowledges his female biology, which he only says is to his advantage. It helps him relate to women he woos in a way few men can. He refers to the term transsexual, someone who medically transitioned to transgender. He doesn't pretend he's always really a man. There's like really weird misgendering there. Like, for one thing, I was in a sense talking to a woman. Like, why is Buck just sitting here and letting a person just like straight up misgender him? Like, Jesus, Buck, is this how you gain self-acceptance, by capitulating to the opinions of TERFs and transphobes? Seriously, what a fucking bitch move. This book has mostly just depressed me as I read it. Like, it just echoed every TERF and right-wing talking point about trans people without any pushback. She won't say this, but I think she wants two classes of people entirely. She has this quote about a trans woman in public causing a stir doing her job and describes it as professional, but needed to point out for some reason, like, what is the woman supposed to do? Stay home and not work so little girls won't be appalled at a different type of woman? She relates gender ideology to autism and vaccines, but has no counter-arguments to different perspectives on gender. It seems like her whole goal was just to write a book filled with these arguments without understanding much of trans history at all. Like, she brings up lesbians who have an issue with trans women as a group that is critical of trans people, forgetting the fact that gay and lesbian people have actually historically excluded trans people, and so spouts some talking points without context. And then, of course, the existential skepticism of gender. How do you know that you are really trans? Which, like, if anybody's curious, the counter to that is, how do you know that you're cis? This is why kind of debating TERFs is not really that much worth it. And it's because they honestly are not going to care about all the stuff I mentioned. But at least this has made a good laughing show, and we can all talk about this further in the comments. So this took a lot of time to make. I had to read this book a bunch of times, and there is a lot of shit that I didn't even cover in this book. There's like, holy shit. Like, there's this whole quote about like, hold on, like, the Salem witch trials of the 17th century are closer to the mark, so are the nervous disorders of the 18th and 19th century, and the neurasthenia epidemic of the 19th century, anorexia nervosa, repressed memory, bulimia, and the cutting contagion of the 20th. One protagonist has led them all, notorious for magnifying and spreading in her own psychic pain, the adolescent girl. Like, her distress is real, but her self-diagnosis in each case is flawed, more the result of encouragement and suggestion than psychological necessity. Like, she has shit like that littered throughout the book, and, like, it would take me so many more videos to fully go through, like, how much shit's in this book. So I just broke it down to some of the bigger points, like how Ken Zucker, why he might be discredited in sexology, why people question his methods now a lot more. And I felt it was more noteworthy to kind of go after, like, the bigger arguments, you know, Lisa Lippman and Ken Zucker, and, you know, like, just attack some smaller points. Like, she doesn't have any understanding about gender, and, like, I think she just thinks that it's XX and XY, which is, like, really funny because she, like, she might not even understand, like, intersex people exist. I don't know. But I guess if you liked my content, this was a lot of fun for me because I got to read a bunch of books. If anybody's really curious, chapter 7 in this book, Whipping Girl, is more than enough to explain like 9 out of 10 things in this book. And I feel like this is a much better read because there's a lot of good shit in it. Oh, look at this. Look at all these names here. Look at all these names here. Your name could be here if you're a patron. But, like, you know, you'd have to be a patron to get your name there. Anyway, you know, subscribe to my YouTube channel if you like my content. Like, comment, subscribe, share. I don't know. This was fun. I also stream on Twitch. I typically try to, but, like, I keep on running into technical issues and shit. And it's also blazing fucking hot. Oh my god, it's blazing hot. Anyway, thank you guys. Bye. Actually, might make it a 13. This is a little too big. Dr. Lisa Littman is Anne, Sammy. Like, you're fucking one of your ex's middle name.
You might put this in a blooper reel someday.
Not really.
No. Okay.
And they all seem to cause
Flatulence.
yes, flatulence. They cause flatulence.
Camera person, camera crew. That's what you can call me.
You're a whole crew.
I could walk out. Take everybody with me.
We're done.
You're waking up with me?